Could we have a round of applause, please, before they get started? Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for coming out. Thanks to all of you out there in Zoom land for joining us tonight. It's always such a pleasure talking with Pap Ndiaye. And there is so much I would love to talk with you about tonight, my friend, but we only have an hour. I'm going to try to touch on a bunch of subjects regarding both the USA and France. But let's start with America. You and I first met back in 2008 on what I think as the Obama circuit, that constant swerve interviews and panel discussions about the campaign, which now seems like some long lost age of innocence. And going back to those days, there's a particular quality in your writings, your talks, your interviews that I deeply admire. You are very direct and at the same time, very nuanced. And that's an increasingly rare combination. And you bring such a sharp, fresh eye to American history, and especially African American history. I often feel that I rediscover my native country reading you and listening to you. Our conversation tonight, I thought it was the first event for Black History Month. It's February 1st anyway. It's the first event in the American Libraries series marking Black History Month 2022. Everybody knows February is Black History Month, but tell us, for all the folks out there who might not know, what were the origins of Black History Month? How did it become a tradition?
Thank you, Jake. Thank you for your nice introduction, and thank you to the American Library here. It's great. I remember my days as an undergrad students coming here and checking out a few things that were unavailable elsewhere in Paris. So I have very fond memories of this place. To get back to your question, Jake, the discussions around a moment of celebration and talks and reflection onto African American history started in the interwar period. I remember browsing through what was then the Journal of Negro History that was created in the early 1920s, and there were issues, people asking for the creation of such a moment, and also with the idea that this would balance, so to speak, the overall racist or ignorant understanding of American history when it came to the African American experience. This was a time up to the 1950s when slavery was described in fairly positive ways by historians such as Phillips, who was the well-known historian of the time regarding slavery. So the idea, following works by W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, was really to provide another understanding, another view of American history, especially on slavery, but also on such issues as segregation and various forms of racial violence. So it's a century-long history that, in fact, got institutionalized in a more recent period, following the civil rights movement, following major changes in American history and American politics. I remember that when I was a student in the US at the University of Virginia in 91, 92, the Black History Month was celebrated for sure, but it didn't have the importance it has now, I guess. There is a growing importance, I think, and a growing mobilization among, including in universities, in very institutional circles that did not exist to the same extent 30 years ago. So I would say that it's a growing rise since the 1970s, with a growing institutionalization, meaning that central institutions do celebrate the Black History Month in ways that were not so clear a few decades ago.
I hope it endures, because I mean, I was a high school student in the 1970s. I went to a very progressive school in New York, but I remember Black History Month well, and a lot of it was about just taking people you wouldn't have heard of from out of the shadows. And today, I mean, I've encountered Americans who are younger than I am, who feel they know about, say, American painting. They've heard of Thomas Eakins, but they haven't heard of Henry Ossawa Tanner. They've heard of Edward Hopper, but they haven't heard of Jacob Lawrence. So I think there's still, you know, this is something that needs to keep going, and people need to really appreciate that. In addition to, you know, commemorating the great struggles of Black people, it's also commemorating achievements that are often overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely, and it remains, I wouldn't say controversial, but there are highly conservative, reactionary politicians in the United States, I won't mention his name, that do not celebrate the Black History Month, or who do consider that as a way to rewrite history, as a way to denigrate the heroes of American history. So it's not, it's a battle. I mean, it's an issue, still an issue, a political issue as well.
Yeah, well, let's talk about this moment in America. I suggested earlier that the dawn of the Obama era seemed very rosy and perhaps overly optimistic in retrospect. And for my generation, I'm exactly the same age as Barack Obama. The generation of kids that grew up watching the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement unfold on TV. We always wondered what would happen if there was a Black president. And now we know. And something I badly underestimated was the violence and the longevity of the backlash to the election of a Black president. To my mind, the backlash began the night Obama was elected and is still going on, taking on different forms over the past 14 years. Is that how you see it as well, or not?
I'd be curious to know what makes you think that the backlash started the night on the election night when Barack Obama was elected. I didn't feel that. I felt that even the Republicans, I would say moderate Republicans, acknowledged that the US were living a historical moment, that there was something so important going on in this night of November 2008, also something that spread throughout the world. I remember I was in a cab, actually in the Obama circuit you mentioned earlier, and the cab was driven by a guy from Haiti, if I remember well, and he was asking me about whether Obama was elected or not, and it was around 3 o'clock in the morning. So I said, yeah, it's, you know, Ohio had just fallen on the Democratic side. So I said, yeah, I think this time, I think Obama is elected. So the guy stopped his car because he was crying. He was crying in the street of Paris. And I think it speaks volume about the historical moment. And this guy was intelligent, and he was smart enough to realize that his life wouldn't change with Obama at the White House, but he understood very well that he was living a historical moment. So he stopped his car.
I think people the world over celebrated the moment. When I speak about a backlash, I'm really talking about something more in the nitty-gritty of American politics. So that the night of Obama's inauguration, a group of prominent Republicans met in a restaurant and settled on a strategy of total obstruction. So in the legislative branch, you had, you know, half of the legislative branch basically deciding we're not going to cooperate with this president, and he hadn't done anything yet. It was the night of his inauguration. In 2013, in the judicial branch, the Voting Rights Act was eviscerated. The rise of the candidate who shall not be named, the Obama's successor in the White House, his whole political career. I mean, he was a very well-known figure in the media, especially where I'm from in New York. His whole career was a reaction against Obama's presidency and the birtherism. And we've seen, again, I think a whole series of events. And certainly one of the most grim milestones of this era occurred in Charlottesville, Virginia, in the summer of 2017. And Pap, you actually lived in Charlottesville 20 years before that horror. What went through your mind during those awful days in 2017? Did you think this was something that could happen in the Charlottesville you knew?
No, as Charlottesville is a college town where the University of Virginia is located, of course. So it's a college town with thousands and thousands of students with a very active student life, academic life, etc. When the main campus is a couple of miles west of the central area of downtown Charlottesville, so to speak. It's a fairly small city with the statue of General Lee. So I didn't realize that there was a statue of General Lee before, late in my stay in Charlottesville, as I didn't spend too much time in this area. So it's as if Charlottesville had a campus life on one side and was on the other side a more southern city, which it remains very much, with the deep divide between the African American population and the white population. There's an African American mayor now, but it was not the case back in the 1990s. So I didn't feel that too much in the campus. In the campus area at UVA and Charlottesville. I think you're right about the backlash. I'm thinking about it, and I'm thinking about this long history of a Republican Party that has moved to the right so much. And it didn't start with the guy that was elected president 5 years ago. It started a long time ago, and even before Obama was elected. If you think of Newt Gingrich, for example, back in the mid-1990s, when Newt Gingrich theorized the radicalization of the Republican Party, and the idea that the Republicans didn't have to cooperate with the Democrats to find some common ground, that they had to oppose in a very brutal way and stop the various forms through which politics in Washington was done, with the various social forms, with the dinners, with the club, the golf parties, and things that made politics possible. And Newt Gingrich in 1994 said, let's stop that. We have to engage into an ideological war with the Democrats. So there is a long history, a pre-Obama history of the Republican Party. But you're right in the sense that when Obama was elected, that was another step, I would say, with, in particular, a very central point which you mentioned, that is the massive disenfranchisement of people who don't vote for the Republicans, and especially African Americans, but also the youth and other groups of American society, with the 2013 Supreme Court decision, which you mentioned, that basically dismantled the Civil Rights Act of 1965. That is a turning point. And you may be aware of the constant efforts by the Republicans to disenfranchise and to suppress the voting rights of millions of Americans. So we're in another league, so to speak, when comparing to the 1990s cultural war, ideological war. There is something very disturbing in the way the Republicans now are threatening the very foundations of the American democracy.
Yeah, well, January 6th last year was certainly a huge turning point. And there is actually talk these days about the possibility of a second civil war in the US. There are a couple of books out now predicting a civil war. So let me ask you, do you think America is on the brink of a civil war? And what exactly would that look like? And if it's not civil war we're looking at, how do you define the bitter conflict going on in the country right now?
I tend to not to buy the historical image, even if it's powerful and seducing in many ways to speak of a civil war. Of course, there is this dimension, but the civil war, it's something else. The civil war, we're talking about a real war with 600,000 people killed between 1861 and 1865. And back in the 1960s, there were talks also about a civil war coming when some Republican politicians warned of and were afraid of the radical left, of the Black Power movements, and were hoping for Nixon to be elected, actually. And Nixon played very much on this idea to restore order and to end this period of anarchy, of radical left. And they used this idea of a potential civil war that had to be stopped. So, and there was no civil war, of course. So I think we should be a little wary of the rhetoric of the civil war. Now, it does not mean that we're not in a we're in a serious situation in the United States. I mean, clearly with as I said, I think the central role of the Republican Party and his and the actual threats onto democracy with what happened on January 6th, which you were right to mention that. So I really worry about not so much the American politics as such, but I worry about the Republican Party, which I think is needed in any, we need a conservative party in the US as well as in France. But conservative people, that's fine, that's part of society, but they have to respect the foundations of the democracy. They have to invent some kind of inclusive policies. They have to welcome anyone, which is not the case of the Republican Party. So I think to me, the real issue is that of the drift of the Republican Party outside of what is acceptable in a democracy.
Yeah, and yeah, I also think, you know, I mean, I can't imagine, well, there's a lot of stuff that's happened recently that I can't imagine, but there is a kind of strange sort of relitigation of the Civil War taking place, whether it's about removing statues and Confederate flags, or the proposed ban on the teaching of Toni Morrison's Beloved, a major novel about slavery written by a Nobel Prize winner, a ban that would be imposed in Virginia's public schools. I've heard the expression cold Civil War, and maybe that's apt, you know, that's sort of like the Cold War, you know, it's going to be mutually assured destruction if you go all the way. So there's a lot of hostility, but you know, we can hope it doesn't become an actual shooting war. There's an opening on the US Supreme Court. And President Biden has vowed to appoint an African American woman, which of course has become controversial. So far, there have been only 2 Black Supreme Court justices, Thurgood Marshall and Clarence Thomas. What do those 2 figures tell us about the trajectory of American racial politics and the role of the Supreme Court in civil rights issues over their 2 terms? And how might the presence of the next Black justice affect the court?
When Thurgood Marshall was elected at the Supreme Court, this was in the 60s, I'm not sure, 67, I think, yeah. He had a long and distinguished career as a lawyer for the NAACP. And he, as a chief lawyer for the NAACP, played a major role in the Brown v. Board of Education decision by the Supreme Court. So when he was appointed in 67, he was very much appointed in this period of the Supreme Court that opened in the early 50s, much to the surprise of Eisenhower when he appointed Earl Warren as Chief Justice in 51 or 52. Earl Warren was a lawyer and a justice in California.
Governor of California.
Governor of California. That's right. He ended up governor, conservative. And Eisenhower said that he appointed Warren because he slept throughout the day. And he was hoping that as a Chief Justice, he would continue his nap. And he acknowledged later that this was the biggest political mistake he's ever made in his life, as Earl Warren proved to be not at all a guy who slept throughout the day, but he radically transformed the Supreme Court, transforming the Supreme Court from being an institution that protected property first and foremost, to an institution that protected human rights. That's a major change in the history of the Supreme Court. So Thurgood Marshall was appointed very much in this period of a liberal Supreme Court in many ways, and things, of course, started to change slowly in the 1970s and accentuated in the 1980s, up to the point when now the Supreme Court is clearly conservative, is clearly leaning towards a literal interpretation of the Constitution, and seems to be ready to throw out of the boat Roe v. Wade and major advances, the major advances of the 60s and 70s that include, of course, Roe v. Wade, but also include a number of issues related to voting rights, a number of issues related to the rights of inmates, and so on and so forth. So that's another change, maybe as important as the one that Earl Warren started in the early 1950s. So in fact, the appointment of Clarence Thomas was very much part of this new conservative wave, of course, as Clarence Thomas has been on the highly conservative side of the Supreme Court, of course. He hasn't spoken much. He's known to be very quiet in the Supreme Court, but he has constantly sided with the most conservative judges, including Antonin Scalia, who was his tutor in some ways, quote unquote. So being African American is one thing, being liberal or conservative is another thing, and you can always find conservative African Americans such as Clarence Thomas. So now we're talking about the appointment of someone who will make the Supreme Court a little less caricatural, possibly, we'll see in the future. But in any case, the appointment of a woman, an African American woman, is of historical importance, of course. And this is a promise which Joe Biden did, of course.
Yeah. I mean, well, I do think with it, it's one of those painful ironies of history that Thurgood Marshall was succeeded by someone who dismantled so much of what he fought for. And if you think of the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court in 2013, that was a 5-4 decision with Clarence Thomas in the majority. I think there's a little bit of a parallel of Ruth Bader Ginsburg dying and being replaced by Amy Coney Barrett. It's her ideological opposite. And we'll see with the next one. I think it's going to be a brutal fight, a brutal nomination fight to get the next justice appointed. And we'll hope for the best, because there are a lot of strong candidates out there. So let's talk more about France now. When we first met in 2008, it was around the time that you published your book, La Condition Noire, which quickly became one of the landmark texts in the study of identity in this country. And it might be hard for Americans to realize just how challenging it was. You're bringing this sensibility into French academia, because back then, the French didn't even like people to call themselves noir. And the word race was and remains a kind of taboo word in this society. The R word. So how do you see France's evolution on these issues over the past 14 years?
I would say that this evolution should be analyzed as a twofold evolution in many ways. On one side, I do believe that French society is changing in many ways, and that it is possible to talk about issues that were seen as illegitimate 20 years ago. So it is possible also in the academia, as there are, and I'm very happy that there are many courses, very popular courses that discuss racial issues that did not exist 15 years ago. This is the case at Sciences Po, for example, and in many institutions, which are now, of course, attacked as being woke, or as being, just leftist and things like that. But in any case, it shows how interested students can be. And I'm not only talking about Black students, I'm talking about white students, students of all origins, who are interested in exploring racial issues that were for so long swept under the rug, and that remain a little touchy and sensitive in France. So that's one point. The other point, which of course goes in another direction, is that French politics hasn't changed, and on the contrary, I believe that there is a radicalization of discourses around the denunciation of wokeism, of Islamo-gauchism, as some people said a year ago. Now it's almost forgotten, as woke has replaced. I remember this discussion a while ago on the politically correct wave that was supposed to, just invade the French academia. So there's now a political rhetoric that targets universities, that targets people interested in racial and colonial, post-colonial issues, which did not exist to the same extent back in 2008. So that's a matter of concern. But again, I think we should make a distinction between the complexity and the interesting evolution of French society and the French public sphere, the one you see on TV, which is saturated with reactionary, let's put it that way, sometimes even, extreme right rhetoric that targets in an extremely violent way anyone who dares to speak of issues that are supposed to be non-French.
Yeah, well, there was almost I feel back around the time we first met, such a denial and a reluctance even to use certain words, because then that leads to examining the issue. And I remember about 14 years ago, a French reader asking me, "Why do you call yourself Black?" As if it were some kind of curse.
Yeah, or shame, as if it was a matter. But he was. There is another issue, which is that of accusing people who talk about racial issues of being Americanized, of being influenced by the Americans. So there is an anti-American rhetoric which is extremely powerful around these issues, which is so ignorant of a century-long intellectual and cultural French history.
Thank you.
These issues.
Yeah, well, you had a very eloquent response to this attack on wokisme in the magazine Jeune Afrique recently, and this idea that these were ideas that had recently arrived from America. And as you point out, Aimé Césaire and Léopold Sédar Senghor developed the philosophy of la négritude here in Paris 90 years ago. So I think in a way, it's almost a sign of how successful you've been in getting people to address these issues, that you're being attacked in this way. Around the same time I met you, I also got to know other writers of your generation, Alain Mabonkou, Rokhaya Diallo, Mabula Sumahoro, and you've all thrived in bringing a Black consciousness to the arts, culture, intellectual discourse. And I think this reaction you're seeing, just as the hysteria about critical race theory in America, we have that parallel happening here. And I think in France, it's more just wanting to impose that denial again, rather than the same sort of violence one feels in America.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a denial, but I think it's more possible to say, well, yeah, I'm French, but I'm a French Black, and I shouldn't be ashamed of it. I shouldn't hide it. What's the problem? I mean, what's the problem? It's not, some kind of deviant moral thing. It's just a possibility to be a French Black, and that's not a way to say I'm turning my back onto universalism, as Césaire taught us. It is Blackness is a way to access universalism.
Yes.
It's a way, it's not a denial of universalism. Yes. It's a road to universalism, but not a universalism that is understood as an Occidentalism, as a Eurocentric thing. It's a way to take seriously the concept of universalism, yeah, and to expand it beyond the boundaries of Europe, yeah, and to look at the Caribbean, for example, to think of Césaire as part of the universalism, and yeah, to say, yes, it is possible to be a Black man, and to acknowledge that, and not to be ashamed of it, and not to deny that. Yeah. And in the same time, because you acknowledge that fact, to be truly universalist, to be truly a brother and a fellow human being in many ways. Yeah. So I deeply feel that in ways which I did not feel 30 years ago, but now that's definitely something I don't see any reason to hide.
Yeah. And just again about embracing a word, and I'm old enough to remember in America when the polite term was Negro or even colored. And then when I was 7 years old, James Brown came out with the song, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. I loved that statement then, and I love it today. In recent years, you've branched out from history and academia and become deeply involved in the arts and culture. In 2019, you collaborated with Columbia professor Denise Murrell on the monumental exhibition, Le Monde Noire, at the Musée d'Orsay. That show was a major cultural event that affected the way people see and think about art, about history, about the politics and culture of a country and its place in the world. Black Models, as it was called in English, was also a resounding success, attracting 400,000 visitors, twice the number that was anticipated. And the visitors were younger and more diverse than typical museum goers at the Orsay. The result was all the more remarkable since, as the then director of the Musée d'Orsay said, the subject of the show was considered, quote, delicate, unquote. In the aftermath of that show, the then head of the Orsay, Laurence Decars, has been appointed to direct the Louvre Museum. Your fellow curator, Denise Murrell, has been appointed to a top position at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And last year, you, sir, were appointed director of the Palais de la Porte Dorée, which encompasses France's National Museum of the History of Immigration. Could you tell us, we have some time left, could you tell us a little bit about the history of that institution and your vision for its future?
Mm-hmm. You're right when mentioning the Modèle Noir exhibit that even to well, to Laurence Descartes' eyes, I think even now is and by the people of the Musée d'Orsay is considered as a landmark in the history of the museum. There is a before and an after Le Modèle Noir because of its immense success, for sure, far beyond what was expected. Also because I think there was a lot of fear before, I would say, about some protest, about some papers in journals that would criticize the exhibit, the very idea of the exhibit. So a lot of people were worrying about what would happen when the exhibit opened, and nothing happened. Just the crowds, and the crowds cheered. And as you said, not only a lot of people, newcomers to museums such as the Musée d'Orsay, and you could see the people looking around, and not the habitués, not the usual suspects of museums, but people who went to the museum for the first time because the museum was speaking to them for the first time. They were coming because, my goodness, there are people a little similar to us that are depicted and talked about. That was a landmark. And this was seen, I think, and it may be actually also a landmark and a watershed moment in the world of museums. Let's do things that were not possible before, and it's popular and it works, right?
So what are your plans for the Palais de la
Portorée?
No, this is great. Don't apologize. This is great.
So the Palais is, as you know, a colonial monument that was built 90 years ago for the colonial exhibit, the International Colonial Exhibit of 1931. So it has a strong colonial dimension with the paintings, with the sculptures, celebrating French colonization. So I think one of the first thing to do is to do something with this monument, this colonial monument, and not just talk about it from a purely aesthetic standpoint, but have a historical look at it. So we are planning a large exhibit in 2 years from now that will talk about the 1931 exhibit, the colonial exhibit, the construction of the Palais, and so on and so forth. It is highly important to take seriously this issue of colonial history, which the palace embodies in so many ways. You know, there is no museum of colonization in France. Maybe in the future there will be, but not yet, surprisingly enough, or not so surprisingly enough. And I think that we can do this, we can be a museum of colonization, not the whole colonization of France, but at least for the 20th century, the interwar period, the decolonization times. So that's the first dimension, which I want to promote this place as a place where we speak of colonial / post-colonial issues and do something with the decoration, this heavy decoration, which shall be explained, contextualized, historic, and put in historical context in many ways, etc. Let's do something with it. The second dimension I want to focus on is immigration, since the museum, National Museum in the History of Immigration, is located there, the French Ellis Island, so to speak. And my purpose is really to expand the scope of the exhibits that will include non-Europeans in many ways. We are planning a large exhibit on Asians, East Asians and Southeast Asians in 1.5 years from now. That will be the first exhibit on migrants from East and Southeast Asia, a large exhibit in a national institution, exhibits on the Caribbean, the Sub-Saharians, and not just the neighbors, the European neighbors, as was customary before. So we need to look at that and to consider the history of immigration in connection with the imperial history of France. So we'll talk about in the in the permanent exhibit that opens next year, the first room will be about the slave trade, because the slave trade is a form of migration, and a museum of migration needs to speak about the slave trade, so that the visitors will enter the museum with a large room focusing on the slave trade. So this is something that was unheard of before. And in a way, we should not speak of immigration. I think the word itself is not right when looking at the migrations from one continent to another, from Africa to the Caribbean, for example. It's not immigration, right? It's a migration. Or the Indians and Chinese who migrated to the Caribbean. Is it immigration? It doesn't work. So we're talking about all the forms of worldwide migrations that are part of French history. So that's about the immigration dimension, or the migration dimension, La France mondiale in many ways, worldwide France, with this mix between migration, colonial history, that helps us understand what French society is all about. You know, I like to tell my students what's the longest boundary, land boundary France has with another country. So they usually hesitate between Germany and Italy, maybe. No, it's Brazil, right? It's Brazil with French Guyana. So that's, you know, the longer. So if you speak about the connection between France and Brazil in South America, then you engage into a reflection on French Guyana, why French Guyana is French still. It's a département français d'outre-mer. Of course, the history of slavery, with the history of marronnage, all the runaway slaves that crossed the border between French Guyana and Brazil, and so on and so forth. And then you engage into uncharted territories in many ways when it comes to the French master narrative of national history. That needs to be talked about.
And your inaugural exhibit as director is still on for a couple of weeks, yeah? Picasso, L'étranger. I think it ends on the 13th of February. I've seen it, Picasso, the Foreigner in English. It is just fantastic. It's a revelation. It makes you see the artist, his work, and an era of French history in a whole new light. And I feel that that's what you're really doing. You're just like, you know, putting a different, looking at things with a different lens.
Thanks to Aniko and Solal, who is the curator, it's really a way to look at Picasso as someone who never got the French citizenship, right? He was denied French citizenship when he applied to it in 1940, when he badly needed to become a French
with Franco
citizen.
in Spain, the Nazis about to arrive in France,
and he was denied French citizenship. And later in the post-World War II period, of course, he was this highly celebrated painter, but he refused this time to become French. He said, when I needed, you didn't want, so I'm not going to accept French citizenship now. He joined the Communist Party. So that was his real citizenship, communism. In many ways, which we show in the exhibit. So that's, I think, a way to look at Picasso through the focus of being a foreigner in France, being an immigrant, issues of papers. And it speaks to many people these days when we realize that for 40 years, he arrived in France in 1901. Up until 1940, every day he woke up worrying about being arrested and being sent back to Spain. That was his life. This highly celebrated painter, very wealthy, and so on and so forth. One of the most well-known painters of his time had this vulnerability, this fragility of being literally undocumented.
Yeah, I urge anyone listening to us to go see the show. You got 2 weeks. Okay, I think we've come in. All right, okay. I didn't monopolize you too long, Pap. I think we're ready to open the floor to questions now.
Can we have a big round of applause? Thank you so much. Thank you to Jake for your very carefully written and thoughtful questions.
Indeed.
Yes, and thank you, Pap. Do we have any questions in the audience, first of all? Yes.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. My question is, well, you mentioned French Guiana, and you also, well, you started the conversation talking about the Obama phenomenon in the US back in when he was elected, and also the backlash that followed. Just this last weekend, I think we had a turning point in French politics with the well, Madame Taubira, Christiane Taubira, the former justice minister under President Hollande, becoming a major presidential candidate in France. For the first time, we have in France, a woman of color, a Black woman, representing a major, a major presidential candidate for the first time. Is this, in your opinion, a turning point in France, in French politics, in French history, in the same way or in a similar way that Barack Obama's rise was in the US in his time? And is this, in your opinion, even though you talked about, the different, the increasing polarization of French society, with a lot of voices rising, in the far right, and racism being, a reality for many people in France, in Europe, and elsewhere around the world. Are there also signs for optimism, such as I mentioned, the rise of Christiane Taubira as one of the strongest candidates of the left in France? And are you optimistic about the future of race relations in France, especially when we look at maybe at the younger generations in France?
Thank you. Christiane Taubira, as you know, was a candidate at the presidential election back in 2002, 20 years ago. So maybe that in 2002, this was, some people thought of a turning point, even if she was seen as a small candidate with no real possibility to be elected or even to be in the second round of the election. I'm not sure this time she's seen as a big candidate. Is she? She's, as you know, in a not so easy political position. I don't know what she will do and how she will perform, so to speak, in April. But the real turning point will be when a Black woman such as her is in the second round of the election. That will be when, with a real possibility of her being elected president, her or someone else being elected president. We are far from it for many, many reasons that also include a main big difference between the US and France in this respect. When Obama was elected president, there still be, I guess, it's still the case, about 10,000, at least 10,000 elected African American officials, from the lowest ranks to the US Senate, few at the US Senate, but more in the House in Washington. So we're talking about a very thick layer of officials, and Obama in many ways rose from this world of African American politics that grew in the 1970s and later on. When looking at the French situation, we are talking about a very different situation with very few non-white elected officials. So I would argue as a historian that the first step is to thicken the group of elected officials from which one day an exceptionally gifted person, preferably a woman, will be elected president. But there is this first step that is, I think, needed in French politics. So my argument would be, let's work at the from the bottom up, so to speak, which I'm not criticizing Christiane Taubira, but I see that still as an exception in French politics that may not change things the way Obama did 14 years ago. Now, am I optimistic on French society? Yeah, I'm relatively optimistic when looking at the youth. And studies suggest that racist or discriminatory practices among the youth are lower than among the older generations. It also depends very much on education. The more educated people are, the less likely they are to be racist, at least when they have an opinion. So there are many issues that tend to acknowledge the fact that French society tends to, in spite of what we know, is more tolerant than what it was back in the 1970s. The number of racist crimes, for example, has declined since the 1970s. So I think it's important to look at the broad historical picture in spite of extreme right powerful voices, but extreme right powerful voices, racist voices, should not hide realities of French society, which are better in many ways. So I tend to look also at the more optimistic side, which does not mean that a catastrophic political event can happen, just like in the United States. A few years ago when Trump, here we go, was elected president, this could happen, or the equivalent could happen in France. On paper, we're not, who would say that's impossible when 5 years ago, people said that Trump would never be elected president in the United States. So let's be prudent. But overall, French society is more tolerant, is more open, is more open to issues that were seen as highly problematic 50 years ago. For example, interracial marriages. You may have seen this very great documentary a few weeks ago, Les Noirs en France. That was very, very good. You can watch it on replay. And there was this TV program of the 1970s with women being asked about their white daughter marrying a black man. And they were saying, oh my God, it's horrible, and so on. And so they were complaining, etc., etc. So things have changed in France since the 1960s. So I don't believe in a golden era that would have existed back in the old days. I think that overall, the French society is more tolerant.
Thank you. Yes.
I don't know, this question is for either of you. There's something when I arrived in France that I found quite fascinating, in that a lot of French people, some who are quite racist against Arabs, though they say black people, they're nice, you like music, but Arabs, they don't like them at all, are very sympathetic to Black Americans and sort of feel their pain, admire the black jazz musicians, praise them. And on the other hand, when you go to America, they respect France as being not racist. And you also have all these black people who would come, Billie Holiday and Nina Simone, some who came to live in France and were accepted as, but because they were American, they were not French. And you have lived in both countries. And I think maybe you'll be able to answer this, or to, I don't know, put a light on to see exactly why and how come the Americans don't accept their own blacks, but like the French ones and the opposite. It's very interesting.
I remember once I flew to San Francisco and I took a cab to Berkeley University. I was going to Berkeley, and there was an African American driver, and he said, "Where are you from?" I said, "From Paris, France." So, and he said something that struck me. This was about 10 years ago or 15 years ago. He said, "Oh, I heard that blacks have a good life in France." So I said, "Where do you hear that?" I mean, well, he said, "I have a great uncle who, as a soldier, spent time in France back in the 50s, something like that, was when there were so many French soldiers, American soldiers being stationed in France. And he came back to the US and he said that, he did not endure the same forms of institutional racism that existed in the United States at that time. He was from Louisiana, if I remember well, and migrated to San Francisco. So he was talking about segregation as well. He was talking about various forms of racial violence that did not exist in France in the 1950s. So he came back to the US and he told his family that blacks had a good life in France. And then I met his grandnephew who was driving his cab in San Francisco, and he said, "Oh, I heard that blacks have a good life in France." So it talks, I think it speaks volume about the endurance of this positive image of France among Black Americans that was confirmed by a number of studies, including studies that in the early 2000s, when there were political tensions on the Iraq war issue between the French and the Americans, there were studies suggesting that the only group that resisted anti-French rhetoric under George Bush Jr. were the African Americans, who did not buy the kind of
the anti-French hysteria of
right.
in 2004,
That's right. That flourished at that time. So I think that there is a history which, of course, should not lead us to think that racism does not exist in France, as African Americans living in France know. But clearly, they are in the, let's say, racial hierarchy of France. African Americans are a step above other blacks, because they are Americans. So they are associated to a powerful country. And James Baldwin wrote on that.
We just studied Equal in Paris in my class tonight, a famous essay by James Baldwin about the experience of being arrested in Paris. And it's absolutely fascinating when he finds out that actually, oh, here he's an American before he's a black man. I mean, we could go on. It's a huge question you ask, but it does go back to World War I, and black soldiers went back to America after World War I and said, "Oh my God, I just didn't feel stigmatized." And then with jazz, the jazz that came first with soldiers, Black American soldiers, James Ree's Europe, the Harlem Hellfighters, bringing jazz to France, the 1920s. Josephine Baker, who was just inducted into the Pantheon. So there is this long friendly relationship between African Americans and the French.
Yeah, absolutely. Which again does not mean that African Americans were blind to various forms of institutional racism. You may have heard of this. I don't remember the name of this novelist who wrote about the October 61 events, when so many
William Gardner Smith.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's a novel that they published years ago, The Stone Face.
That's
and
right.
It's just been republished. Yeah.
So they were also keenly aware of the, especially the Algerian War, which did not target blacks as such, but more people being seen as Algerians, Arabs. That was deadly, including in France. They were also aware that people coming from Africa or the Caribbean did not enjoy the US umbrella, so to speak, and had to endure forms of racism that are not as lethal or brutal or open as in the United States, for sure, but that existed, of course, and that have a legacy, a very powerful legacy in nowadays France.